start, will introduce, and then I go after Giuliani?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Olá, pessoal. Bom dia a todas as pessoas presentes. Pedimos desculpas pelo atraso, tivemos alguns problemas técnicos aqui, mas vamos dar início ao nosso terceiro dia de minicurso com a professora Jeanne Dubino. E eu tenho certeza que teremos uma manhã muito frutífera e prazerosa com as contribuições da professora. E hoje nós temos aqui a colaboração da professora Gigliane Souza, que vai nos ajudar com a mediação da sessão de hoje. Ok? So, Gigliane, Jeanne Dubino, the stage is all yours. So, Gigliane.
Hello, guys. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very happy for the invitation and honored. Since 2 days ago, we started having the classes with Professor Dubino. It's been a really interesting moment, and I'm pretty sure that everybody's learning a lot. So thank you very much. And I think actually this stage is for Professor Dubino.
Okay, so Jeanne, off we go. I'm going to upload your presentation.
All right, very good. Thank you. Bom dia. Thank you. Muito obrigado to everyone for being here. Thank you, Victor, for hosting this. Thank you, Maria Aparecida. Thank you, Giuliani, Maisa, and everyone who is making this possible. So I am featuring here a picture of my university. Here is the library, and where I teach is way up on top of this hill over here. So this is where I teach. This is where I have taught all of my virtual exchange classes. So today I'd like to talk about what a virtual exchange class is. And if we were face to face, I probably would ask you who has taught a similar class. And I would imagine that some of you have taught this kind of class in one way or another. So here is my email address. And if you forget that and don't write it down, here's my name. It's not a common name, so you could probably find me fairly easily online, but here is my email address. So I was introduced to virtual exchange classes here, I'll keep this here, about 12 years ago. And I'm going to talk, first of all, what is virtual exchange, how they got started, this kind of teaching got started. And then I will talk about my experiences in the hope that you can see the many different ways one can conduct these kinds of classes. So I will start here with what it is. So virtual exchange, which I will abbreviate as VE in subsequent slides, it's basically a kind of class that connects two classes located in different geographical spaces with one another. So I am a professor of global studies, and I am interested in getting my students to experience the world outside of the US. But the world within the US is also very different. So I could easily set up this kind of class with students in other states across the US. But the emphasis is on two different geographical spaces at the same time. And so you use various means of technology, and I will talk about the technology. So what do you do? It's not just typically one class, but you hold one or often more than one class over in a sustained manner over several or more class meetings. So basically, students at my university, the way I've done it, here they are. I've taught in various buildings here. They talk with students in another university. All right. So why do we do this? What's the purpose? It is to enable students in countries around the world, at least this is true for global virtual exchange classes, to learn more about other countries and cultures. And they do this through conversation, through talking. So one can call VE, virtual exchange, a people-to-people education program, all right? People talking to other people, students talking to other students. Right. So they don't just learn about other cultures and countries around the world. This is a wonderful way to foster the development of language skills. So for me, my students, most of them only speak English. However, the language faculty in my university use this kind of class to teach other languages. So students may speak in Swahili with students in East African countries, or they may speak Turkish with students in Turkic-speaking countries. So, but the good thing about virtual exchange is that students are forced to speak at all, and so they develop their own language skills, even in their first language. Secondly, I know that we're used to saying how young generations are digital natives, but you'll find that not always. So this kind of class furthers digital competence. There are so many other ways of connecting, and not just through talking with each other, but we encourage students to use a variety of other platforms, and I will talk about that. So number 3, these kinds of classes enrich communication skills. I have found that students around the world, including my own, will say, I am so shy, I don't want to talk. And so these kinds of classes just simply get students to talk. And then media literacy, they learn about different kinds of media as they prepare for these classes, what are reliable and what are not. And I had talked about earlier how this kind of class enriches cultural perspectives, but it also gets them to see that the world is a very big place. And secondly, for us teachers and for administrators, administrators, at least in the US, love to include in their list of goals and aspirations, they want to make their universities more internationalized. They want to expand their curricula. And it's a good way for faculty to say, I am participating in that effort, and I would like to include that in my annual self-evaluation, which most US university professors are required to complete. Right. So here's a mini history. So you'll see that word 30, and so that means that these kinds of classes got started in the early 1990s. And we think about how email got started. We started connecting to people around the world. Early on, I know I started my first email accounts in 1992, 93. And so virtual exchange immediately became a part of that. So these classes were first taught by anthropology and language professors. I know that when I was trained back in 2012, my colleagues and I met with anthropology professors. They are very interested, anthropology professors are interested in getting students to do culturally comparative analyses. So you'll see that that kind of perspective deeply informed my first class. But language faculty are also very interested in getting students to talk with native speakers, and they hopped on this bandwagon right away. So I don't usually have to drink so much water while I'm talking. But those of you who have attended my other seminars know that I strain my voice, and apparently what you're supposed to do is drink a lot of water as you're talking. All right, this kind of class took on added relevance during the pandemic, at least in the US. Many students in universities around the US are required to do study abroad classes. Those were put on hold for 2 years. And so this kind of class often took the place of study abroad, whereby students immerse themselves in other cultures. And so this was a kind of substitute. But so many students did this kind of class that this kind of class has spread even more across the US. Long. So how do you do it? All right, that's the next part of this class. We move from what it is, why it's a good thing, what its history is, and now how do you do it? Well, first of all, in the US, faculty need to find universities within the US, yes, but for people like me in global studies, we select universities around the world. And how do I select these universities? Well, I select them through programs like the Fulbright Specialist Program that brought me here now, but I also attend conferences within the US, conferences in other countries, and I meet faculty at other countries. And I just get a feeling for who might be interested in teaching this kind of class and how this kind of class could fit into their classes. So one can avail oneself of connections. My university has an Office of International Exchange that can also put faculty in touch with international faculty with whom our university has partnerships. So if you're not somebody who goes to conferences and meets international faculty, at least international to the US, or if you're not a Fulbright specialist, you can work with your international studies offices, around the world. And I know that many Brazilian universities, if not almost all, have these kinds of offices. So having selected the faculty, what happens? Faculty in universities meet over the course of the term to set up these components of classes. And so these meetings take place over Google Meets or Zoom or StreamYard and faculty or WhatsApp, and faculty talk about curriculum. Now, my curriculum is, it's a general kind of curriculum where I can talk about any one of a number of global issues. But the faculty with whom I have connected my class, they tend to teach literature, because when I go to conferences, I meet faculty in literature. And so my students who are typically are general education students, not literature majors, they will talk with early literature majors. Sometimes the classes are also in cultural studies, like, for example, I've had students meet with students, my students in the US meet with students in Egypt. So they could be cultural classes, which can be kind of universal. And sometimes they're language classes. So anyway, my curriculum tends to be different from the curriculum of the faculty with whom I meet in other countries. And so you make adjustments. Because I'm the one who typically initiates these classes, I like to give the decision making to the faculty with whom I'm teaching. So I typically will ask them to choose the readings and the topics, because I am so flexible that whatever they choose tends to work with my students too. And then as far as the class format goes, most of the classes are based on discussions. So students know what they are going to talk about, and then they supposedly, and I'll talk about that, supposedly will get ready for those discussions. And then the faculty in other countries and I decide on the kinds of assignments, and those can be very different depending on which faculty you work with. One of the most sometimes interesting and challenging parts is working with time differences. So daylight savings time in the US happens usually in, and not just daylight savings, but daylight savings and then standard daylight time. We go through those changes twice a year in the US, in what is the US springtime around March, and then the US autumn time, which is around November, October. So the clock either moves ahead or it moves back, and it's very, very easy to make mistakes. So anyway, you have to work those things out because, for example, I teach classes in China, and there's a 12-hour time difference. China does not go through any time shift. And so if my class starts at 8 o'clock in the morning, US time, it starts at 8 o'clock in the evening, China time. And so if my class moves ahead by an hour or moves back by an hour, that means the Chinese students have to be ready to talk at either 9 o'clock in the evening or 7 o'clock in the evening. So anyway, I bring that up just to show you that that is something to think about. So number 3 is it's really important to say that there are so many ways of teaching these classes, so that you can see I bold-faced, I did all caps, screaming caps, I call them. There are different designs for different classes. And it is so important to be flexible and to sort of, and we teachers are used to flexibility. We know how to change things on the drop of a dime. You need to be able to do that. So ideally, we prepare students in advance for the discussions that take place. So how do we do that? Here's what I do. I have my students read the text. I ask them to take multiple choice questions to make sure that they in fact did read them. I will ask my students to write about the text so that they will have some experience generating ideas. And then I will sometimes give them discussion questions so that they will be ready to talk when they talk. Now, they don't always do this, but that's okay. And what you can do is prepare students to talk about certain texts, but because they're the ones who are in charge of the discussion, sometimes the discussion goes into interesting directions that one isn't always prepared for. Now, I have taught this class with students in China and in Turkey and in Egypt, where there is a lot of censorship. So you could never, ever talk about Turkish politics or Chinese politics or Egyptian politics. My students can talk about politics in the US, but they cannot talk about politics in other countries. So part of the preparation that I do for all my classes is we talk about what you can and cannot talk about. That is a source of frustration to US students who are used to the First Amendment. But we talk about how to be culturally sensitive to certain issues. And so that is a big way of preparing students. And that's what I talk about. So they read books about all of the countries that we meet with so that they're ready. And I can tell you that my students are often very nervous even before the discussions begin. And by the time we start the discussions, they start to almost immediately become more comfortable. But you do have to be ready for nervousness and shyness. And by the end of the semester, they're completely over their shyness and nervousness. But these are just some of the ways that you prepare. So students do most of the talking, and the faculty act as facilitators. And that can be challenging in countries where the faculty do most of the talking. So that's one of the preparations that you do. You say, you know, we're there, we sit in the background, the students do the talking. And then number 7, the students have to be fully present. That is, they have to see each other's faces. And that can be challenging because I know, especially during the pandemic, many students did not want their faces shown. Sometimes there are connection issues, and so you can't. So students will let you know in advance. But with Zoom and with other platforms, there is the chat, and so students can avail themselves and use the chat function. So this is the setup, and I'm just kind of giving you a sense of, you know, how to do this. So I thought that I would just talk about 5 of the classes so that you can sort of see how I did it. So look at if you look at the name of this course, Global Understandings, this is a course that is designed at my university for first-year students. And it's a way of getting students used to the curriculum. These courses always have a theme, but it's about getting students to learn how to do research, how to conduct themselves as students in the classroom. So faculty will choose themes. I mean, I've had students who do Harry Potter or Philip Pullman or oh gosh, so many themes. The Beatles. A number of faculty at my university are interested in the Beatles. You choose whatever theme. So with this class was heavily influenced, like I said, by an anthropology professor. And so you can see this strong anthropological bent, understand, explore, appreciate the nature of human diversity and globalization. So our students talked, our US students talked with students in 3 different Asian countries, with students in China, Taiwan, and there you already see a problem if you know, if you've had experience with China, because of course China sees Taiwan as still technically part of China. So even to say 3 Asian countries can be delicate, and we talked about that with our US students in advance. And many many Taiwanese people do not see themselves as part of China. And then the third country was, or the third geographical region was Thailand. And so we wanted to show students that East Asian countries are not of a piece. People think differently. They have different kinds of relationships. And so students needed to learn that. So students researched those countries themselves and with us. And we, in the 5th bullet point, we talked about how globalization can relate to business, politics, historical understanding, aesthetics. One of the people who taught this class with me, Ray Miller, is a dance teacher. He was keenly interested in dance. And so because of his interest, and because dance is an important part of all cultures, that was one of the things we talked about. So what was our goal? To get students to understand in a more nuanced way how cultural values, attitudes, issues impact the direct interactions with people of other cultures. And we put these criteria on our syllabus, all right? And so did the faculty, and we shared our syllabus with the teachers in other countries. So these are the ways we grade the assignments in the US. We have a more sort of teacher-driven way of assigning grades. So we had students write reflective journals for China, Taiwan, Thailand. So students had to write in advance about the discussions, and then they had to reflect on them. They undertook creative projects with students in 1 or more of these countries. And when they did this project, they used all of the media. WhatsApp, of course, is so important. They texted, and they got basically to meet with students, not just as a class, but one-on-one. So anyway, in the US, we typically have a score of 100 points, and so they could get up to 100 points. All right, so that's the first time. So 4 years later, I taught another class, and this was a class, a special topics class that I had taught actually 15 years before this, but not as a global, as a virtual exchange. So I had spent 2 years in Turkey from 1997 through 1999. And I became very interested in the question of Orientalism. So a few years after I taught the class, 9/11 happened in the US, and we saw a lot of Orientalism taking place, the stereotyping of the East. So this kind of class becomes even more important to diminish that way of, that kind of, not just kind of, but very sort of racist way of looking at the world, because students in the US were kind of bombarded by media that did not represent people in the Middle East in favorable ways. So in a way, I had a kind of political desire to offset those kinds of negative stereotypes. So here is the course description. We examine Western representations of the East and Eastern representations of the West. So we did not just look at how the West regards the East, but we looked at text and any kind of text, movies, etc., on how the East regards the West. We will critique these often stereotypical representations and come to understand some of the cultural underpinnings and geopolitical reasons for both Orientalism, the way the West looks at the East, and Occidentalism, the way the East looks at the West. And look at the range of attitudes, fascination, awe, interest, sometimes contempt. We discuss topics such as student life, what is multiculturalism, travel and ideas about travel, uses of technology, the American dream versus Turkish goals and aspirations, and more. So for this class, my students talked with students in about 4 or 5 different, let me see if I have it on the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, no, I guess I didn't. I had students talk with 4 or 5 universities in Turkey to also give them a sense of how Turkish universities differ from each other depending on where they are. Like the western part of Turkey is more Western centric. The eastern part of Turkey is more kind of conservative, more rural. And so students could also learn about the big divide between the urban and the rural in Turkey. And that got them to think about the big divide between the rural and the urban, even within the state of North Carolina. At my school, in my state, there are students who live in pretty, one would call the richer areas, you could say, of the state, like the Research Triangle, where the University of North Carolina is located, and then the Mecklenburg area, which is not far from where my university is, about 2 hours away, where there's a lot of banking and so on. But large parts of North Carolina are rural. And so my students come from rural communities. So it's very instructive for the rural students to talk with rural students around the world, and for those who live in more urban areas to talk about their experiences. And the urban area students at my university don't know that much about the rural area students in the state. So they get to learn about their own state, along with learning about, what it's like to be in other different kinds of areas. So you can see how the discussions, move in such interesting ways. So for this class, we talked a lot about visual media, like movies, like art. We had students watch the same movies and talk about them. My students and their students read a book, On the Road. We talked about that by Jack Kerouac, which is a kind of quintessential travel book about a group of men who go traveling across the US. And then we watched a very popular movie in Turkey called Yol, or The Road, also a travel movie. So you can see how fun this class would be. And most of the students, my students talked with, were people in literature, because I just happen to know a lot of Turkish faculty in literature. Right. So then 3 years passed, and my department chair wanted to set up more and deeper connections between the University of Innsbruck and Tyrol. Now, I know nothing about Austria. I have spent time in Turkey and Kenya and China and Egypt. But as far as Western Europe, I've traveled a bit through it, but I've known it as a traveler. So this class required me to have to do a kind of binge course on my own and learn about Austrian culture, in particular mountain culture. But not only that, my department chair at the time is very interested in Appalachian studies or mountain studies, another topic I do not know about. So I had to read a lot of literature and read books, even though my university is located in basically Appalachia. I teach here, but what do I know about it? And I learned that many students who attend my university were in the same position. They didn't know about Appalachia either. And so they needed to learn about the area where their school is located, because they come from the Research Triangle or Mecklenburg County. So even though it seems like they're not far away, they don't know. So we all of us in my class had to learn about an area that we were all currently residing in. But at the same time, we learned about the Tyrol Mountains from students who live in those mountains. So this is what you could say is a mountain to mountain exchange. So we, learn about mountain cultures around the world. So anyway, that here is the course description. Students in Austria and students in the US, we read the same text about mountain life, novels about mountains. We watched films about mountains. We talked about language, how it differs in Appalachia versus, say, the language in the rest of North Carolina, the different accents that people use. So students in Tyrol learned about us, we learned about them, and we learned about ourselves. So I found this to be a really rich class. All right. So here are some of the assignments. Students worked on a final project with each other. And this is just an aside. One of my students became engaged to a student who was on the other side in Austria. And so I don't know if they're yet married, but anyway, how cool is that? So when she did her study abroad, she went to Austria and got to meet this other student. So these connections can often deepen into other kinds of connections as well. All right. So then the final set of classes that I will talk about is a class I teach very often called Contemporary Global Issues. So once again, I linked with students in 5 universities in Kenya and Turkey, which is now called Turkey, but I'm going to use the word that I'm most familiar with, the name of the country. But we also linked, for the first time I taught this class, with a university in Egypt, because I had spent time there, not as a Fulbright specialist, but as the partner of a Fulbright specialist. And as it turned out, I pretty much did a lot of the same kind of teaching and presentations that my husband did. So anyway, students got to learn about life in Turkey and life in Egypt. I would have liked to have connected to more universities, but we had a lot of partnerships going on. And my students, my partners, were especially interested in the genre of Western films, which have have become popularized around the world, issues of migration. So the U.S. Has a long border with Mexico. The border is something like close to 2,000 miles, and what would that be in kilometers? Over 3,000 kilometers with Mexico. A lot of people cross the border. There are something like 12 million people who live in the U.S. who were not born in the U.S. Many issues. Turkey also has a lot of different different groups of people living in their country who were not born there. Most recently, Syrians who have been driven out by the war that started in 2011, supposedly has abated, but still there is fighting. And so there are well over 3 million people, but there are wars from around the Middle East that have driven people out. So there are people from Afghanistan. There are a number of people from sub-Saharan and Saharan Africa. So Turkish people are also living with these issues, and so are Egyptian people. Especially people come to Cairo from the southern part of the country. So students have an awful lot to say about that. And so my partners wanted to talk about that. They wanted to talk about masculinities. One of my partners named Baysar, he studied under one of the leading masculinities theorists in not just Turkey, but around the world, Murat Güç. And so that came up. We talked about stereotypes, and we talked about friendship. So one of the most, I would say, popular parts of the class was talking about masculinities, because we saw indeed that there are so many similarities, and we had some very rousing and intense discussions. We talked more about Orientalism and Occidentalism. We talked a lot about the role of technology in friendships. And so this was a very popular topic too. And we talked about, you can see the date of this class. This was not too long. This was near the end of the pandemic. And what happened to friendships, that got us to discussing things like loneliness and so on. So very powerful class. And so here are some of the assignments that students did. One of them was an ethnographic project where they pursued one of the topics that we learned in more detail. And the students we talked with typically were students in language and culture classes, but also some literature as well. One of the exciting parts of this class is we had poets read to us, we had featured speakers, so you can do that as well. So here were just some of the here are some of the things that students learned. My students take for granted the freedom that students have in the US. And so they marveled over the idea that you can't just say whatever you want. And they talked a lot about that. They talked about family meals. This was a topic of such interest. Like, so many students in the US do not sit down with their families during mealtime, and they were shocked to see how much. A number of students in my class have served in wars, and they talked about what that was like. That was eye-opening with our partners. And then some students in Turkey are required to undertake military service. And so the students there talked about that. They talked about the experiences their friends and brothers had. We talked about surveillance after the class, because in the classes that we met with in Egypt, there was a dean present. So they were always aware of someone there and what impact that had on the class. We discussed different words for friendship and love in Turkey. There's really close love, and there's more like friendship love. Guns, students in other countries are pretty shocked and horrified by the US relationship with guns. Frankly, I'm a bit shocked and horrified by it too, but we talked about that, the treatment of migrants. And then one of my partners really wants to talk about Faulkner, William Faulkner. So my students read a short story by Faulkner, Barn Burning. And we got to talk about the difference between the US South and the US North, which was of great interest to my students, because sometimes people in the US South, when they open up their mouths and people hear Southern accents, these students are treated differently, as somehow lesser. They're treated as other. And so that was, edifying for students in other countries to learn about that. And then we discussed, again, masculinities, the treatment of the elderly. So these are some of the things that they learned. And then later, 3 of my students talked about what they learned in a workshop. I wish I had snapshots of Zoom. I should have included that. But anyway, here's just a picture of 3 of my students who discussed their experiences. Rachel talked about the different words for friendship. Abigail talked about how Turkish people said that migrants were favored over the treatment of other Turks, and she researched this and learned that, in fact, it wasn't the case. And then Ismail was very interested in masculinities and how similar they seem to be across the world. So, concluding thoughts, this is an effective way to instill an awareness of cultural differences. You can build as much or as little of virtual exchange into the course as you like. My classes tended to be based on it, but other faculty don't have that freedom. So they would just devote 1 or 2 or 3 classes. You can connect with one university through the course of the entire semester, like I did with the Innsbruck class, or more. With Zoom and other platforms, you only need a strong internet connection, no other technology. When I first taught this class, you needed this whole apparatus, but now you don't. Students in all 6 classes responded favorably. They love this class. And then one finds that virtual exchange can lead to other kinds of collaborations for both students and faculty. So these are, some of the things that I learned. I just have such positive things to say. I will say one negative. It does take some time to kind of set up, but once you've done it and you have experience, it works. Through this kind of class, I now will call on faculty from around the world and talk to my class. Like I taught a class called Global Infrastructures. So I've had people from around the world who, for example, in mining, mining is a very big thing. I met someone who works in mining, talked to my infrastructures class, mining in Africa. I talked to someone who looks at the life cycle of a product, a Turkish person. I actually met her husband when I was a tourist. He asked me if he could help me out. We became friends. I met his wife. We've stayed in touch. So you can really, it's interesting. You can just meet people even off the street, which I literally did. And so, you can, I learned this. I teach a class called Animal Planet. I met someone at a restaurant who owned a restaurant in Egypt who rescues dogs off the street. I asked her to talk to my Animal Planet class. My colleague, my now friend, is a very young woman in her early 20s. And so my students think it's really cool to have a young person talk to your class. And I think this kind of class made me feel empowered to even ask people whom I just meet to say, hey, would you like to talk to my class? So anyway, you never know where this kind of thing can lead. So I will stop here and entertain all questions from you about how to go about teaching this kind of class. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Dubino. It was a great lecture. And we have some comments here to start from some of the audience. Jessica Alves said, that's such a rich example of how to create an inclusive course. For me, it instantly resonated with yesterday's discussion because the classes include several types of disabilities in its project. And Eduarda Valentini complete. I agree with Jessica. It's really important for us soon to be teachers to always be creative and inventive in finding the best, most inclusive ways to teach diversity within the everyday classes.
Yes, I mean, you can. Sorry. Go ahead. You were going to say more. Sorry.
No. I would ask you if you would like to comment about it.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I tend to jump in. Absolutely, and you could even see that, for example, if you want to talk about, say, if you want to tie this class in with yesterday's discussion on literary disability methodologies and approaches, you can ask a professor at another university who specializes in that. Or if a student wants to talk about what it's like to be a literature major and not be able to hear, you can see the different range of possibilities. So you're not limited to internationalizing the curriculum, which is what you can see that's clearly my emphasis. But you can do so many other different kinds of inclusivity. I mean, disability, animal studies. I told you about my global infrastructures class. We look at things like mining and highways and what else? The internet and the prison industrial complex in the U.S., which is a big topic. And so I have brought activists who work in prisons and jails in the U.S. to my classes through Zoom. I mean, that's the main platform that we use. So you can kind of take a topic, and if there's not somebody who's a specialist at your university, you can find somebody who is, or someone from conferences, and invite them. So I think that, I mean, this isn't just about students talking to each other, but you can have experts come.
Yeah. I would like to bring a kind of polemic topic when it comes to online education or virtual education, because here in Brazil, that is a kind of disbelief around the online classes. Somehow this changed a little bit due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The schools, they had to use it. It was a way to keep teaching the students. But when it comes to universities, for example, there are certain people that do not believe that the online courses were so good as the in-person courses, that even some discussions in the Congress about how much of the classes were supposed to be online. Have you ever faced something like that in the other places that you teach? Because you said that you teach in Turkey, in China. And what do you think of that?
I have, and I've faced that kind of issue at my university. So when we hold these discussions, my students are actually all sitting in the classroom, right? And they have either their phone or they have their computer, and they all have to be on mute when someone else is talking. And so they're not online because they're with each other. And then I typically will devote about an hour to the discussion, an hour or 45 minutes. So I talk with my students beforehand. We have the discussion with the students in another country, and then we have the wrap-up discussion. And so they're there, they're present. So you can say, nope, they're present, and we're talking, the online is featured during the class. And that is how my partners also run their classes. In some universities, they're not so strict, and so the students do not have to be present, but that's pretty rare. They too are sitting in a classroom, a very standard looking classroom. And I, again, am very sorry I don't have a picture of that, but if you look at the picture, they're present. And I don't know if that would work in the Congress,
Well,
but
we
you can
have,
say, yeah.
no, keep going, Professor. Mhm.
Oh, yeah. No, so I'm done. Yeah.
We have a question from Ingrid Fernanda. She asks, how can we assume to be teachers overcome the invisible distance that comes with teaching virtual exchange classes? Also, is there a way to instigate the students to participate in this class?
My advice is to prepare, 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 and to encourage. And first of all, talk about why you're doing this class. Students always want to know why they are doing something. So build it into your class goals. And then secondly, have them, if you're doing international like I am, have them read a lot in advance. My classes usually, the virtual exchange component starts about 4 weeks after the class begins. So I have, for example, in the last 2 classes, I had my students read a lot of things about Turkey and Egypt so that they got a feeling. I showed them videos, we read books, we read articles, we watched YouTube videos. They're all on TikTok. They had to watch, TikTok videos themselves. So they had to prepare. And then I prepare them with the discussion questions that they have to, ask in advance. And I have them come up with discussion questions. And I have them talk in small discussion groups with each other so that they get used to talking. And I, of course, have them read the text. So I try to prepare in so many different ways. And then is there a way to instigate? I base the part of the class grade on how much they talk. And I tell them, I give them mid-semester grade. I say, you're not talking enough. You need to talk more. And I also say, if you do not want to use your voice, you can use the chat. Some people say, no, chat is cheating, but sometimes you have a discussion taking place on the screen and then sometimes in chat. And so I do not allow any private chat. It all has to be public so that there aren't, but sometimes my students will take their phones and they'll do WhatsApp with students in other countries. And is that such a bad thing? But I just do heavy preparation. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll call on my students. If we're all in the classroom, I'll say, hey, Roger, maybe you could say something about this. You've talked about this before, So sometimes I'll just call on my students, and sometimes they freeze and say, I don't want to talk, but sometimes they respond. So lots of preparation.
Interesting. And Professor, what about the different ages approach? Because some of us teach kids, some of us teach teenagers, some of us are already teaching at the college. So how would be your advice when we are working with different age students?
If I would say with college students, as long as they're undergraduates and graduate students, my undergraduates my first year students, who are typically 18, though not all, have spoken with graduate students who are in their 30s, and it works and they like it. And the students or graduate students in their 30s they're actually studying to be teachers too, and they learn about what it's like to be what US students are like, and they find this of interest to them. So that's okay. But with children, I would say as long as there's an approximate, give or take 2 or 3 years, you can find. And so I would say that, give or take 5 years. Yeah.
I don't know if we have more comments in the chat. Let me see. Oh, we have a question here. What might be the challenges regarding digital literacy?
I think that might be a more of a challenge for young children, young students, let's say K through 5 through 11. But I think that even they have some familiarity. So I think you have to prepare them. Show them how to use Zoom or StreamYard or whatever platform you're using, and practice in advance just with your class. And after that, they learn pretty quickly because these are pretty readily accessible platforms. One of the challenges I find, sorry, can I
Go.
finish? I just thought of something. I do find, though, that when it comes to research, and you want students to research on their own, you have to give them research assignments where they do the research of the country on their own. You do have to work with digital literacy, don't you? You have to show them how to even Google, how to use their library databases, and you have to work with them in advance. So I would say that maybe the research is where we have to do more work as teachers. There. Okay, I'm done.
Now, and I think I even connected with what you said, because I was asked about the materials, because sometimes we have to use like the books, all the material that the schools give to us. So how do you manage that?
I find if my teacher suggests, my companion teacher suggests a text that he or she or they cannot access, I will find it because I have such great access to material, and I send it to them. And I send that to my fellow teacher, and my fellow teacher then gives it to all the students. So that's on me, and I will find the material. And if my fellow teacher has access to something, which has almost never happened, that I don't have access to, then that person must send me the material so that I can share it with the students. But gosh, so much stuff is online that's almost a non-issue. But you do have to make sure everybody has access, and you have to share it.
We have a question from Joaquin Calisto. How can we work with lyrical education virtually, as in order to attend some needs of specific students that are neurotypical and other disabilities? For me, it is a struggle when I'm working virtually.
Can I apologize and say I'm not entirely sure what ludical means? I think in the US, lud sort of means play, but then maybe this is related to playful. It is. Okay, playful. All right, good. Okay. I think that is a challenge in and of itself with ludical students, with who are not neurotypical, And so I think that one would have to go to kind of teacher specialist in terms of, asking, well, what are the specific strategies that one uses for online education? I mean, I do have students. I have at least two or three now who will tell me that they are on the autism spectrum. And one has said, I cannot keep my camera on. Do not make me keep my camera on. And of course, I respect that. And so I say, okay, just as long as you participate in the chat and as long as you write thoughtfully before and after the discussion, I understand. And that's something. So I think that that's where, people who are specialists in different kinds of technology would be one of the best sources for talking with students online. But with my own students on the autism spectrum, I mean, some of them can be somewhat surprising to students in other countries, but are not students in other countries used to students on the autism spectrum? And isn't this about getting students to be mindful, not just of international difference, but all manner of difference, and that are not just related to geography and social class and rural and urban. And so I think that that's important. I mean, like, I had a student in one of my classes who had the strongest Southern accent, and the Turkish students could not understand him. But why not let them hear that accent and try to figure it out and be mindful of the different range of accents in the US? Just like my students are not used to hearing English spoken by people who are not from the US. They have a real struggle, but they learn, and they really need to learn, different kinds of Englishes and English accents.
And you also mentioned that during the classes there are different types of exercise, activities, tasks. So for the students who suffer because of their neurotypicity, it must be a way that trying to help them use those different tasks, those different activities, so they will trying to navigate as better as they can, right?
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, they can see that difference does not just lie in neurotypicity, neurospecificity or types, but it also lies in culture. And so they can kind of see that, oh, this is just another form of difference. And in some ways that can be kind of empowering. Yeah, and they might feel less lonely. I know that one of my students who definitely presented as sort of, on the autism spectrum. I just thought she was fantastic, and I loved working with her. But I think she felt really sort of alone, and I think that after the class was over, she said there was just something about talking with so many different students at so many different universities and in two different countries that made me realize that, I'm just part of, a larger global community. And so I think that I think this kind of class can be of service, yeah, of use, and also of joy. I mean, that word ludical, I love that. I mean, why not bring play into our discussions? And speaking of play, I forgot how much soccer or football is a part of discussions. Football is not so popular in the US. But of course it is in Turkey and in Egypt, especially, and in China. And so, of course, it is in Brazil, futebol. So anyway, football can be one of those equalizers, and then students can learn about U.S. football, which is a whole different, to use a cliche, ball of wax.
But it's always working. When it comes to soccer in Brazil, it will always work. And
Yes.
something that I would like to know, Professor, is that if you believe that we can teach anything and in a virtual way, or do you believe that there are certain things that they will have to keep me teaching in person classes?
I think it depends on the topic. Um, one of the people who at my university who has loved this kind of class is someone who works in our tech program, our technology. And she works in furniture and clothing design. And so she loves virtual exchange because the students at our university talk with students who my colleague knows in universities around the world. And they talk about different ways of doing design, furniture, clothing. And so even though this is a very hands-on degree, that's what they do. Now with lab sciences, I don't know how that would work. I mean, this kind of class would work with
I don't know
social
if it's my
sciences.
connection then
Have you lost the
that is
connection?
facing
Sorry.
some problems.
But yeah, it looks like you might be frozen. I'll hold on.
Our back was my connection that faced some problems. I'm sorry, guys.
Okay. Okay. Yes, I can sort of make out the discussion from the chat. Giuliani, can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can.
Okay. So I would say that this class would be good for social sciences, for humanities, of course, and along with the humanities, languages above all. So ideal for that. But who knew that it could work with things like technology? And one of the big things that my colleague does is she has her students and students in another class, another country, do projects now together. And there are some who build and study abroad. And so students visit, my students, our students, Appalachian students go and visit students in the countries, in the country where they have done the virtual exchange class. So that happens. As far as science goes, I don't know how that would work. It probably could work, but maybe it might be more for the discussion. So why not look at how the labs are run in other countries? You know, I would say that there is a range. And of course, I'm talking at the university and probably high school level. But K through 12, I would think, you know, it might be harder to kind of, you know, get them to kind of focus on the screen. And I think you'd have to bring in other kinds of pedagogical strategies.
Okay. I think there's someone else that would like to ask something. Moises? No?
Hello.
Hello.
We can keep on talking. Maybe someone else has a question. And Jean, and now I am in the conversation because I was afraid Giuliani could not come
Come
back
back.
due to the connection. And when you were, oh, we have so my question is not important now. We have a question from Luana. Giuliani, could you?
Professor Dubino, I would like to know about your expectations regarding virtual teaching in the future, and how do you deal with the students who have limited internet access, like already happened to me?
Yeah, I mean, that actually can be an issue. For example, the presumption is that the students are sitting in the classroom and they can use their university's internet access, right? So that they would not have to pay. Students should not have to pay for a dime of this. And the presumption is that at least the students would at least have a cell phone. Now, if they don't have a cell phone, then I guess that would require that someone, if someone has two cell phones, maybe lend that student a cell phone. Does the university have an office that could provide an extra cell phone? So these are some of the, yeah, I mean, as far as limited internet. But the presumption is that the students will be, or assumption, that they will be on campus and they can use their university's internet. They should never have to pay for this. But during COVID, we were all at home and there were connectivity issues for sure. And there were among my students too. So my students would go to internet cafes. They often were at internet cafes. And so they would turn their screens off and they'd have to, get earbuds or headphones and so on. So we all had to kind of be flexible and innovative and so on. But now that we're out of COVID, I guess we could be physically present, but that is a good question.
Thank you, Luana. And Jeanne, while you were talking, I was thinking about my experience as a virtual English teacher during pandemic. And I used to think back then that I do believe that the problem is not on the media, because sometimes in face-to-face classes, students are not paying attention, they are using their cell phones, and sometimes on virtual classes, there are students who are really committed to the process. So I don't know, sometimes I have mixed feelings about that. Sometimes I believe that it's not about the media, but on digital literacy, I believe, because face-to-face classes, I can see your face, but online classes, I cannot see your face because some students don't want to turn on their cameras. Or some students used to come to me and say that they couldn't learn properly online because they preferred in-person classes. So I don't know. So there are a lot of things around this issue. I don't know if I have like a really formed opinion about that, but I don't know. I just believe that it's not on the media, the problem. I don't know. What do you think? If it's
I
the
so
media.
concur. Yeah. I mean, we all had to teach online, right, during the pandemic. And I really don't like online personally. I mean, all online, where we're all sitting in our spaces. I just don't, right? I mean, we use it because it works even for this kind of format. But I myself don't listen very well either often. I mean, and so if I'm not, what the struggle, the potential for distraction is great. So that is true. So this is why when I do teach this class, I want my students in the classroom. And all right, I will say you can see the sort of difference. I teach at a university where students, well, they do come from definitely not the most prosperous backgrounds, but they do typically have computers. And if they don't have computers, my university will lend them to them. And then I tell them to put their cell phones away, actually. And so I will not let them take them out. And so anyway, that way I keep their attention. But what if students don't have that opportunity for computers? I mean, one thing you can do is say, you've got to focus on the class. You have to talk. You have to participate either through the chat function or you have to talk. And you could even have someone walk around and make sure that the class is on their phone. I mean, it's just so important to get them to focus or it's not going to work. So I'm really pretty hard to use it. I'm very strict about making sure. And so how can I know that when they're on their computer, they're not doing something else? Well, I'll call on them up to say something. I mean, I actually I do what is called cold calling and say, hey, what do you have to say about that? And I'll say that when my mic is off and I'll lift my head up and I'll say this, I'm on the screen, but I'll say, all right, Michael, what can you say about that? And he'll say, oh. And so I'll say, well, think about it, all right, and get back to us, just to let them know that I'm paying attention. But this is a struggle with online. And it's why I sure hope there isn't another pandemic, well, for a million reasons. But as a teacher, I so much prefer that being in the classroom. But with this class, I require that they come. Now, around the world, as I said, almost always the students are in the classroom too, because the school requires it. And that's how the teachers teach. But there have been a few times where they were somewhere else. Does that help?
Yes.
I mean, is that more encouraging?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Actually, I was trying to compare my experience to yours and Giuliani's, and I used to establish participation as a mandatory form of assessment, for example. So either through chat or with the cameras and mics on, you need to participate, is part of your grade. Or I used to create links to access Google Forms or Padlet, whatever, to comment on something, a forum discussion. And so participation was part of the assessment. It's something that I established during my courses, and it worked a lot. And my students participated a lot. And even in the classroom, Giuliani used to be my student. I always established participation as something mandatory. But it's not about the participation itself to say something out of the blue with no meaning or significance for the class, but really to establish a moment of critical thinking. Let's think about it. Let's analyze something. Let's have a group discussion. So I think it's important to take a look and understand different ways of assessing students out of traditional ways of just a teacher-centered class. And of course, even if I am the student, I will not pay attention, close attention the whole time. It's difficult. And even as a student, I prefer in-person classes, like you, I prefer. And I also enjoy this moment, this warm moment with my students. But if we have to teach online, you have to be creative, I believe. Right? What do you think, Giuliani?
I will say that some private schools here in Rio Branco, they try to getting those different types of students in a period right after COVID, because certain families were not totally safe of coming back to school, so they would like to keep in the online classes. And then some groups were having classes where we had in-person students and also online students, and the teachers were supposed to manage those groups. And it was messy because it was, we're having two different classes at the same time. So sometimes it will not be possible. Sometimes we have to separate sometimes because students have their necessities and we're not able to attend all those necessities. We're supposed to give them the basic needs, right?
Yes, I agree with you, Giuliani. Jeanne, now Moises wrote something here. I think that there are some subjects, themes that we need to adapt to virtual classes, but sometimes these adaptations might be excluding someone or some important topic. How do you usually make these adaptations?
Well, the virtual discussions do not encompass the entire semester. So I'm not sure this will answer the question, but I think that we make the adaptations separate from the virtual exchange. But if an adaptation needs to be made during the virtual exchange, I'd refer to how there are some students who just for whatever reason, they cannot keep their camera on. I mean, that's one adaptation. And so then you can say, well, use the chat function. And so that might be another one. And other kinds, I mean, I suppose with students who are hearing impaired, that's where subtitles, my students use them just because sometimes they couldn't understand the accents, which I wasn't completely thrilled about, but they would use them on their computers. So that would be and really, as long as they could hear and engage, that was the important thing. But I think we learned to make adaptations within the classroom. But as far as the virtual part, I guess it really relates to camera and sound. It relates kind of to the technology. And as far as topics go, there are just some things you cannot talk about with your partners, like I was saying, politics, with some classes. And there are just culturally sensitive things too that you don't talk about. Like I told my students, do not immediately think that all women in Turkey and Egypt wear headscarves. That's gauche. I mean, no, I don't say that. I say, why do you think we shouldn't do that? And I'll let the students answer that question. So, they, as far as topics go, they need to kind of learn what can and can't. And is that not just part of being a human being anyway? You learn what is okay to bring up and how to carry on a conversation. So, that's just part of, growing up and learning. And one still makes mistakes and faux pas anyway. That's just part of life and being part of human. And you could talk about these kinds of things too. I don't know if that helps, but
Yes. Thank you, Jeanne.
that's a good question. Thank you.
Guys, we are about to wrap up. Do you have any more questions? Jeanne, for 3 days, we have been enlightened by your provoking thoughts, and I'm really happy with that. It's a great opportunity for our students here in Rio Branco, Acre, to have you, a great professor, talking about so different and at the same time similar topics concerning animal studies, disability studies, and virtual exchange classes. And I'm sure all of our students learned a lot. And I'm really happy that some students came to me saying that they have loved to participate and to see you here and to exercise their English, something that they are learning in the classroom, but sometimes they don't have the opportunity to exercise in practice. And this is a great opportunity for them. And also concerning the English language itself, that sometimes in Brazil, some people believe that if you speak English, you are just colonized, or you have a colonized mind. But you really helped us understand that it's not just about the language, but about how we deal with the language, what we do with the language, that your experience as a teacher throughout the world, around the world, has helped us understand that's about what we do with the language, being critically and politically and feministically engaged in the considering the issues that are present nowadays in the world. So thank you so much for that. Giuliani, would you like to say anything?
Well, I would like to thank for the opportunity. It was amazing 3 days. We learned a lot, and I wish Professor Dubino could come back.
And I hope next time you can come to Rio Branco to get to know the north of Brazil. I believe it would be awesome. And I would like to invite on stage Maria. She's already here since it's our last day. And guys, Maria, again, I don't know if there are people who were not here on our first day, but Maria used to be a professor at the Federal University of Acre, UFAC, and now she is in Paraíba doing a great work as always, and she is responsible for bringing Professor Jeanne Dubino for us to have these amazing moments. So Maria.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Jeanne. Hi, Giuliani. Thank you, all of you guys. And I also would like to thank Marisa to be part of this project. And while I was listening to Jeanne, I was thinking and I was having many ideas for us to create this exchange program. And we have many universities who would be interested in participating in this wonderful project. That would be wonderful to have students at US or China or Turkey and bring them together in this wonderful project. And we could talk about multiculturalism, we could talk about globalization and many environment and animal studies, disabilities, and I'm sure that would be wonderful. And I was thinking about o FPB, o FAC, o ERG, Ouro Preto with Rita, o FBA with Lauro, and then Santa Marcelina with Ana Carolina. So I think many people would benefit from this project and even students and most of the universities involved since we are in the internationalization project, and definitely that would be very much um, that would be delightful for everyone and mostly for our students. So that's a wonderful project, and we might put that in practice next year. And it would be wonderful to have you back in Brazil next year, and even in Santa Marcelina, where you didn't go, and to Acre and to Bahia with Lauro. That would be wonderful. So,
Oh my God.
so thank
So,
you very much, Jeanne, to be part of this project. Thank you a lot.
All thanks should come from me to you for making this possible. And of course, you and I are, can I say that you and I are already talking about next year's Animal Planet class, where we will talk about Orwell's Animal Farm, and I have been talking with others. So I'm very excited about the connections that will continue on into the future. And yes, next year we're working on this too. So yeah, thank you all for making this possible.
so Jean, thank you. And I would like to thank Maísa Dourado, UFAC, ProEx, everybody involved with the realization of this project. And of course, these students who are present here who helped a lot. This happened too, because based on their questions and issues, it makes this session different, right? And since we are talking about diversity, so the session becomes different by the time we have diverse thoughts and inquiries. So thank you, Jeanne, so much. Thank you, Gigliani, for mediating this session today. You are wonderful. All of us love you. You are a great professional, and I'm really happy to have you with us today. And also, yesterday, she was with me in my class talking about applied linguistics. So, Gigliani is awesome. Thank you. So, I believe that's it. So, guys, this is our last day, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
1 minute.